L'chaim, l'chaim. Yeah, really, this mute is hashgacha pratis because mianu kulanu to speak in the presence of greatness, the presence of the Rebbe, which the only expression is vayidoim, to be quiet and to listen and to do. But nevertheless, medafdoch reden. So the Mele will use a few minutes to speak a little bit about the inyan of Chof Ches Nisan and how it ties into Deir Shvi. Thank you, Rabbi Levittov, for the introduction. And the Rebbe should help, as the Rebbe would say many times, that the Dvarim sheyifalu bi ubahashemim. So I'm speaking to myself, and hopefully it will influence me and those that are around me. So Bechlal, as an introduction, the concept of us, people, little people, bringing Mashiach is a very big chiddush. It's something which doesn't make sense whatsoever. To think that all the datas that preceded us from the time of the Ovis and then Moshe Rabbeinu, and then everything that happened after that with the Nevi'im, and then eventually the Anshe Knesset Hagdela, the Tanoim, the Meroim, the Ge'edim, and so on and so forth, waited for our simple generation that we should be the ones to bring Mashiach. That's something which doesn't have a place in the Higoyin. It doesn't make sense whatsoever. And that's why Chassidim always knew that the only one that can bring Mashiach is the Rebbe. This is not something that simple Nivroim can actually do. The Rebbe was mechadesh the whole inyan that it's up to us that we have to bring Mashiach. And I want to just bring a few points to this to understand that this is not a gleich vertel, but when the Rebbe said, or the famous sikha that the Rebbe spoke, Purim Toshim Mem Zayin, I remember that I came in from Shlichus that time to be by the Fabrengen, and I brought Balabatim, and that sikha was something that was very difficult to digest. It was very difficult to understand, and the Rebbe said a word there also. He asked the question, that mechadesh, this is inyan, that the Rabbeim, the Nesiim have to bring Mashiach. The Rebbe was very, very serious, which was uncharacteristic in the middle of a Purim Fabrengen. And the Rebbe said an expression that is mitzad yeridas aderes. And a lot of people took the yeridas aderes as if it's something negative that we did that caused us to plummet to the lowest level. V'lachein, there's no choice. And there was some chassidim, I remember at that time, said that we have to reverse the yeridas aderes and let the Rebbe do it. But if you think deeper, and you look deeper, you see that this whole concept that the Rebbe wanted to be meshatef, the Chassidim, and not only the Chassidim, but a whole generation of Deir Shvi into bringing Mashiach was not something that was just because of a fault. It was a reality. And maybe the Yeridas Aderes is mitzad Yeridas Tzedach Aliyah. But you see in the very first Maimer of the Kabbalah Sanasiyas of Yud Shvat Toshin Yud Aleph, when the Rebbe says that it was not in our Bechira that we're in Deir Shvi, but this is something that we are all in, the Lachein and the Far, Montman, Tevim, that says it's demanded from each and every one, man, woman, and child, that this is our tafkid. So it's something which is a very big chiddush. It's something which doesn't make sense whatsoever. Why it's that this way? Could be it's mitzad teva tev lahetiv from the Rebbe, that the Rebbe wanted to be mishatev the whole day. I remember one time in Toshim Lamed Zayin, in the summertime before the Bachrim, we were Bachrim, then went out on Merkah Shlichas, and the Rebbe was telling us about our tafkid to be mevared in Itzutzis wherever we went, to lift the people, b'mkeimam, and that will bring Mashiach. And the Rebbe then said that even if you meet a small child and you give them something to recite a bracha on a shahako, the Rebbe said water or whatever, candy, we'd interpret it to be candy, but nevertheless, when the child says the bracha bircha shahakal, it's mevared and it's tzutzis that we're waiting, and that brings Mashiach. But the Rebbe spoke a Rashi Sikha about Heid HaHor. And he said that Rashi brings the example of Heid HaHor that it's a small mountain on top of a big mountain. And there's the famous mushal, that there was a giant walking together with a midget, with a short person, and they were walking along a wall, and they were very curious to know what's on the other side of the wall. And the giant, even though he was very tall, couldn't see. But he said to the short person, you climb on me, and then you will be able to see, and you'll report it to me. So the Rebbe says that in that sicha, that l'cheiretz a shaila, achsher dora bitmiya, as the Gemara says, is our generation taka, the generation that's proper to bring Mashiach. Is it us taka that we can do it? But he said that it's kinana salgabe anok, like a short person on top of a giant. So he says all the aveda of the data sarishenim, the data sakatmenim that they do, they're taka giants. Elavaven, even with all of their work, they still cannot see what's on the other side of the wall. They can't bring it to the finish line, to bring it to the Zman of Moshiach'dke. Our generation is taka ananis. We have to recognize that we are small compared to them, but nevertheless, we have the ability that the Rebbe picks us up and puts us on the shoulders of the earlier generations, so we're able to reach there. So this is something that we have to understand, that whether it's mitav teva hatev laheti from the Rebbe, whether it was lachatchila, something that was preordained mitzat sheishes yimei bereishis, that's something that I'll leave to the maskilim and the grace chassidim to try to interpret. It's not something which I think that any of us, most of us, have a idea, but this is the fact. So the fact of the matter is that when the Rebbe spoke the Sicha in Toshem Mem Zayin, it didn't saruder enough. Everybody thought the Rebbe was speaking in the Welt, and he was trying to change the atmosphere of the world. What shook everybody up is when the Rebbe spoke Chof Ches Nisan. But the truth of the matter is that Chof Ches Nisan wasn't really a chiddush over Toshem Mem Zayin. I remember that night I was on Shliach, so I listened to it on a hookup, and it was replayed again and again, and there were conference calls, and people were speaking, and people didn't know how to react to it. So I spoke to my father 1 o'clock in the morning, and I asked him if, when the Rebbe went into the room, if he saw any shinui in the Anhagen. And he said that he was wondering himself, or b'meila, when the Rebbe came into the room after the Sikha, after Maidiv, so he brought out Setlach, that with inquiries from people that wanted answers. And the Rebbe began to answer it karogil. In other words, that when I say karogil is that this whole inyan of Chof Ches Nisan wasn't something new. To us, it was a revolution. But to the Rebbe, this was part of the plan and what he spoke about in Toshem Mem Zayin, and really what he indicated in the first Maimon. So the question now is, what do we do about it? And have we done enough? And how does it relate to us today? It's very interesting that when you look at the Rebbe's Hanhaga, B'negei to Deir HaShvi, we see that it's a Hanhaga that was different than any of the Rabbeim that preceded the Rebbe. The Deir HaShvi was totally different in so many different ways, and it's spoken about and written about. Rabbi Yossi would write that the Deir HaShvi, just like Moshe was Mamshich, the Shechina Milmaila, the Matala Oretz, the Rebbe was able to take the deepest inyanim of Pnimi Satera and bring it down to the level that everybody should be able to understand. There's the inyan of the Deir HaShvi, of the Rebbe's involvement in every individual. We see that in the earlier years, there were yechidus. People had an ability to go into the Rebbe 3 times a week, Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday. And then later it was cut to 2 days a week. But then, if you remember, in Tov Shem Hey, the Rebbe said then that he's stopping the Yechidasim for Yom Haledes. And one of the reasons was because the whole unit of Yechidus is the meeting of the Yechidash Nefesh of the Chassid with the Yechidash Nefesh of the Rebbe. And people weren't living up to it. So B'meila, the Rebbe said that he will do a bracha klolis by the Fabreng and Shabbos Bereishis. The Rebbe still accepted people for Yechidus, for people that traveled from out of town or special occasions like bar mitzvahs, chasanas v'chulu. But the inyan of the chassid going in every year, Yom Haledes, that stopped. And there were still people that tried to go in for the mechadesh, and they would fool the one that was standing by the door, which was my father, to say that they had a special occasion. And then when they would go in, they would hand it settle for mechadesh. And the Rebbe spoke publicly about it. And the Rebbe said, "Me make menar tov, der versteht beim Tir, menar sich up allein." Was not sich up allein? The Rebbe said, because the bracha klolis that he gave that Shabbos Bereshis is the bracha through which all the hamshachas come. And if you're trying to circumvent that, you are not allowing the bracha that he gave on Shabbos Bereshis to actually be chal. It was very sharp for the shenis. The Gabi, what am I saying this? Is that there were still many people that wrote to the Rebbe that they want to have a yechidus, and they missed the fact that they can't go into yechidus on Yom Haledes. And the Rebbe said, "Mistame yisnaik kanash la'achreina shenichnosim liyechidus be'eis ha'yisvadus." To translate that, Mistame, you will conduct yourself the way Anash are doing it lately, that they go into yechidus be'eis the fabrengen. So think about this for a moment. The whole idea of yechidus is Panim el Panim, Yechidus is the one and only. It's exclusive. And that was the milah of going into the Rebbe by yourself on Yechidus, even though it was filled with trepidation and awe and fear. And everyone that went into Yechidus alone knows the preparation that they had to do beforehand. And it was just incredible and indescribable. But nevertheless, here the Rebbe says that in the presence of Ribui, Yehudim, so many people together, you're still going into Yechidus. So what's the pshat? The pshat is that the Rebbe had the ability to connect with each and every individual as an individual in the presence of many. And you see B'chlal from the Sichos of the Rebbe, when the Rebbe spoke about what one can do, the Rebbe always spoke in the term of a Yachid, what the Yachid, and do. In other words, the Rebbe spoke to every individual. It's what the Alter Rebbe writes in the Akdama of Tanya, that the Mila of a Nasi, which says about Yeshua, that when he speaks, he can speak to every individual. And we know countless stories of people that came into the Fabrengen, and their questions were answered, and their brachas were fulfilled. This was something that is a uniqueness of the Deir Shvi, where the Rebbe connected with every individual. But my point over here is that even though the Rebbe began to cut Yechidusin, but yet, in Tovshim Mem Vav, the Rebbe started something which was also unprecedented, and that was that every Sunday, the Rebbe would come out of his room and make everyone a Shliach mitzvah, give them $1 or $2 with a bracha. And everyone can come and approach the Rebbe. The Rebbe was Yamot Ke'ilu B'Melech Basada with a smile, and he was listening to everybody. If you would notice that there was a very big difference between the way the Rebbe gave out dollars on Sunday compared to when the Rebbe gave out dollars after a sicha or after a tefillah downstairs in the shul or a kuntris. It was always very, very quick. Masha'enkin Sunday was the time for discussion. It was, as the Rebbe once explained, it was the inyan from Chesed. So the question is, why is it that the Rebbe took out so much precious time and stood every Sunday for hours upon hours upon hours, b'li hefsek, to greet people from all over the world? Muzman doch sagen that this was part of the inyan of the Deir Shvi, that the Rebbe wanted to empower each and every one, that you have the ability to do what you have to do to bring Mashiach. And what does that mean? The Rebbe would quote the Rambam very often about what the Rambam says, that that you should see that the world is shakal and only one, and the Rebbe would taich, and I know they're playing the tape, one machshava, one dibur, one maisa, and that could be machriya, and it's your action. Don't wait for someone else to do it. You can do it. So this is the inyan of what the Deir Shvi is, and what the whole inyan of Tut Alz V'Sikent. He's not only talking globally, but he's talking individually, that we have to do it. And what does it mean that we have to do it? We can't do it just simply. It has to be b'yigia v'avoida v'omo. The Rebbe would speak a lot of times about the inyan of omo. I know personally, several times when I wrote into the Rebbe sent me back betach, that for Yukuyim Etzlei, Haftachas Maimar Chazal v'Yagaito Matzasim. That the Rebbe said certainly will be niskayim by you, the Haftacha. The Rebbe didn't say the bracha, the Haftacha of the Chazal v'Yagaito Matzasa. Nothing will come easy. Even though the inyan of Mashiach is a Metzia, and as the Rebbe explained many times, that this that it says Behesach Hadas doesn't mean that we don't have to work for it. Hesach Hadas means that the Metzia, that the Gilui of Mashiach will be beyond and incomparable to the Aveda that we are doing. But it still can't come without Aveda. The Rebbe said many times, I remember Chav Dal Tevis Tasham Amid Beis, when there was an unscheduled Fabrengen, the Rebbe said that in Chassidus Chabad is nishtok b'derech memele. There's nothing that comes automatic. Nothing is instant. Everything comes through hard work. So this that the Rebbe spoke to us individually and said tut alts, and he spoke to everybody in the generation, means that we need to work on ourselves to change our mindset and frame of thinking to think in a Moshiach'dke way. We have to retrain our brains to think in a Moshiach'dke way. We have to retrain our hearts to feel in a Moshiach'dke way. And it doesn't come through slogans, and it doesn't come through cliches. And I know before the speaker mentioned about all the kinds of communication that we have today, but that's only what we call the head of the spear. There has to be something much deeper, as I will give a mashal soon. But I want to go back to this inyan of the Aveda. You see that the Rebbe himself, in his Aveda, did it with Haravanya, with Omal. The Rebbe says in many sikhs that even if someone has an ability and has the talent and has the gift of being to absorb Teda in a very quick way, it doesn't become part of them if it doesn't go through the inyan of Yegiya, if it doesn't go through labor. There has to be the inyan of Yegiya. Yegiya comes through Omal, it comes through a lot of hard work, of internalizing it, which means to say that for us as Chassidei Chabad, it means to toil and labor in the Rebbe's Teda. Not only to be Yetzer, that we're learning 3 Prakim of Rambam, and we're learning Chitas, and we learn a Sicha and a Maimon of the Rebbe. There has to be the Haravanya, the effort that we put in to really internalize what the Rebbe is saying. I remember when we were Bachrim in the Lamids, the early Lamids, to a Chassidus of Bachrim, that after the Fabrengen, they would go to Chazara with Rabbi Yael, they would make notes for themselves, but then they would say, what does the Rebbe want from me in this Sikha? How is my life changing because of the Sikha that the Rebbe spoke, or the Maimon that the Rebbe said? Alachas Kama V'Kama, in today's times, when we need it most, and we're learning a Maimon and a Sikha, we have to internalize it, we have to harav in it. And this is not only to Chassidei Chabad, this is to everybody. And Baruch Hashem, we have the ability today to be meifitz the Rebbe's Teda in an unprecedented way in every language possible. And I say there's a moment of pride that yesterday I had someone in my shul, 2 people actually that are not Chabad, but they were learning a Sikha from the Rebbe in English, rather, a Diuk and Rashi. But they spent the whole afternoon studying it and learning it and haraving on it, and they were beaming at night that they were able to understand the Sikha, they were able to understand the Diukim, the whole paradigm shift of how the Rebbe looks at Rashi. This is something that we have an obligation to do. This is part of the bringing of Mashiach, bringing the Teda of the Rebbe to the people and bringing people to the Teda of the Rebbe. So this is something of changing our own frame of mind. And this is Miftzah Teda that the Rebbe wanted. Miftzah Teda is Pasha that we have to go out and teach. Then there's all the other Miftzahim. But it comes through Haravanya, the Miftzahim. Miftzah Tefillin is not just a fluke. Even the Rebbe says, Chatei ve'achil, but it has to be built on a very strong yesod. We have to internalize this whole inyan of the Dei Rashvi, how every moment of the day is a day that's given to the Rebbe. Every morning when we wake up and we say Moida Ani, right after that we have to think, what does the Rebbe want from us today? How am I fulfilling my obligation to the Rebbe? That the Rebbe haravet for me and the Rebbe haravet for Klal Yisrael, and the Rebbe is lifting me on the shoulders of the giant, as we mentioned before. How am I living up? If you could just sit and imagine, I remember in 770, one of the things that people would make them very agitated was if the Rebbe was waiting for something, the Rebbe would turn around and wait. The Rebbe vart, everything would stop and you would try to expedite it as soon as possible. If you think for a moment that the Rebbe is standing over you, as it says, V'hine nitzav alav, and avart, he's waiting for you. So that has to cause that you should have that to be able to do the Aveda of the Deir Shvi b'simcha. I want to finish with one thing because we get carried away today, living in our generation where everything is basically either a tweet or a little slogan on Facebook and all the other forms and means of communication. It's all nice and good, but it doesn't fulfill the kavanah. So I want to share a story from Rab Mendel Futafas. And this is a story that we internalized when he would fabreng with us. And the story is that when he was unfortunately, in prison in the labor camps in Russia, so he gravitated, or they gravitated to him, all the intelligentsia. So he had architects and engineers and doctors, and they liked him because he was always happy. He was always besimcha. And they asked him, "Was bist du besimcha?" And he said, "Why are you b'tzar?" And obviously, because their life came to a halt, he said, "My life is Avedas Hashem, and Avedas Hashem could be anywhere." But the story that he told was that one time when they were sitting, so there was an engineer there who actually worked in the military. And he said one of the great inventions that they actually came up with was these kind of pontoon bridges that if you have to get troops and armor to move from one side to the other side over a river, so there's no time to build a bridge. So they have now this very strong material where they fill it with helium. And when it fills with helium, it becomes like a solid item, a solid bridge, and they can have troops crossing over it, and they can have even tanks crossing over it. It's inexpensive compared to building a steel bridge, and it goes up much faster. And in a time of war, it's one of the mechanisms that they have which allows them to progress very quickly. So Rab Mendel asked him a question. If it's so less expensive to produce this kind of bridge, and you can do it quickly, and it can help troops cross over, why are not all the bridges in our country built this way? So the engineer looked at him and he said, "What don't you understand? At the end of the day, it's made of material and it has helium. All you need is one ship to go through, and it nicks it and it opens it up, and the whole thing falls apart, it platzes, and there's nothing left." So Rab Mendel said that he internalized it in Aveda as well. He says sometimes a person comes and he becomes niseder, and but he doesn't do the work. So he's like a helium balloon, like a helium bridge. So it's good for the moment. But then if you nick it with a shtickle yetzer hara, nick it with a shtickle taiva, then the whole thing falls apart. If you want to have a strong yesod in Aveda, you have to work with yourself and transform yourself. And it takes all the planning and the building with the heavy steel. And then when you have something solid, even if it's hit by a ship, it's unmoved and it's there forever. And that's what Chassidus wants. The same thing is true when it comes to Mashiach. It's nice that we have the slogans. In our days, it was bumper stickers. Today, it's a tweet. But that's not the Aveda. That is the result of the Aveda. We have to be grounded. We have to build our own Yesod through learning the Rebbe's Teda and Kochzach and the Rebbe's Maimonim and Sichas and Igres, and Taka internalizing it and doing it, practicing it. And with that, we reframe our minds to be a Moshiach'dke way. We reframe our heart to be Mashiach. And then we can fulfill the Kavanah and Taka bring the Nachas Ruach to the Rebbe. And the main thing is to Taka Sidi is Galus HaMashiach, take of Miyat Mamish, L'chaim, L'chaim.